welcome to the sideboard here at the Star City Games Modern Open in Indianapolis, part of the SCG Tour, brought to you by Ultimate Garden Carnox Chairs. I'm Nick Miller alongside Sam Black, notable brewer, and this is a deck I've wanted to look at for a while. You've been brewing quite a bit since Throne of Eldraine came out. Yeah. You went down to St. Louis, right, to play a modern event, and you played your first iteration of the Mystic Sultai deck.
Yeah.
The deck utilizing this card the most.
Yes.
This common land, and not just kind of floating around in the format. You know, people just saw it in the file, said, what's going on here? And you're putting it to the most extreme use of any deck.
I agree with
What
that.
got the wheels turning with this?
I read this card. And I saw the type line, and I knew about the interaction with fetch lands. And I didn't think that that was a reasonable card to print, so I figured I would take advantage of that.
And where did it go from there? Cryptic Command, a lot of people saw this right off the bat, but then how did you build the rest of the deck?
So, I mean, basically, it's just about, the basic thinking is, if you can live to cast Into the Story, then Into the Story is an engine because of the fact that, like, when you draw 4 cards, you almost always find either a Mystic Sanctuary, a fetch land, or another Into the Story, and then you can just keep going. And so, given that Into the Story gives you unrestricted card draw for the rest of the game, essentially, I felt like all I would need to win is to play cheap reactive cards to get to that point. The other really, so basically, I mean, the deck is essentially based around entirely Eldraine cards. It's Into the Story gives you this late game, Into the Story plus Mystic Sanctuary gives you the late game, and then Drown in the Loch is the, like, most versatile answer in Modern. Basically, like, I mean, it's comparable to these cards.
Right, Abrupt Decay, catch-alls to a lot of cards.
Trophy. Yeah, the split card, hard counter, hard removal spell is extremely versatile, especially in the late game. So I wanted to use that kind of effect to bridge into drawing tons of cards and then having a handful of counter spells. To enable Drown in the Loch, I needed to make sure that my opponent would have cards in their graveyard, which I'm doing through a combination of Thought Scouring my opponent, which turns on both Drown in the Loch and Into the Story, and then Fatal Push and Assassin's Trophy, Abrupt Decay, other interactive cards.
Right, it has almost the delve capability of, if you just play Magic long enough, they're going to have cards in their graveyard. Plus, if you do a little bit of work, you're going to enable all these cards that matter with that. And then from there, it's just this control deck. You're killing things, you're drawing cards, you're making the game go long. And your original list, you had what? Snapcaster Mage as your win
My original list had 4 Snapcaster Mages and 1 Vendilion Click. And that deck played really well, but I ended up getting 2 draws in that tournament. And so I felt like, given the actual nature of the way that tournaments are played, I would need to be a little more proactive about killing my opponent. So since then, I've added 1 Field of the Dead and 1 Torrential Gearhulk, which primarily are there to beat the clock rather than to beat my opponent. But I've actually been pretty impressed with Torrential Gearhulk as far as just, like, being a powerful Magic card and, like, allowing me to close games really quickly. And it also makes cards like Throne the Last Troll a lot less scary out of my opponent. Right,
you have something that can answer the hexproof creatures.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw you defeat the hexproof deck, the Boggles deck, on camera in a pretty crazy display of what the deck can do.
Yeah, that was a really grueling match. My normal plan against them is to just get 2 Cryptic Commands into Mystic Sanctuary, and then every turn on their turn, I can tap their team, bounce Mystic Sanctuary, play Mystic Sanctuary, put back the Cryptic that I used, use the other Cryptic in my hand, alternate those 2 Cryptics and never give them an attack step. Their deck doesn't have any way to break up that loop, and so I can actually just deck them from there. But the way the game played out, I couldn't find a second Cryptic Command, and I was going to die, so I had to Snapcaster my Cryptic to exile it so that it couldn't be part of the loop, and then I drew into my second Cryptic immediately too late. And then I had to, like, find some way to cobble together not dying and turning the game around without access to that loop.
Right. Other cards we got floating around in here, Pulse of Marasa, pretty sweet that it can get you the Mystic Sanctuary back if there's one in your graveyard.
More often you just get a fetch land and get another Mystic Sanctuary, but yeah.
Sure. Snapcaster Mage as well, we got to see you do that, and then it's just all the things start happening.
Yeah.
The Deprive combo, the other part of the Mystic Sanctuary combo. You only, how many copies of Deprive?
Just one.
Just one. And then that's effectively the lock with those
locking
cards.
spells rather than attack steps, but
right.
yeah.
Force of Negation, another somewhat new card this deck got, has to be just perfect for this deck.
Yes, it's very good. I actually wasn't playing it before, and I'm not playing a lot of them now. It obviously pairs really well with Into the Story, but you can run into the issue that your deck is a lot of 1-for-1s, and so if you don't draw Into the Story, it can really hurt to have to throw a card away. But once you're doing your thing, it's definitely great.
What do you think about Into the Story in decks other than this, just like a format in general type thing?
It helps a lot if you are thought scouring your opponent and playing an interactive game, so that like against anyone you're going to be putting cards in their graveyard. But it is the case that like in Modern, people just put a lot of cards in their own graveyard. There are a lot of good cantrips, there are a lot of fetch lands. In any kind of like interactive deck, it almost always costs 4 mana by turn 4. And it's very hard for me to imagine a deck that isn't interactive that wants to draw 4. The one place where it would be reasonable to look for this kind of effect, but I wouldn't want that card, is blue-white control. If you have a lot of like Path to Exile, Condemn, Terminus, Oust type removal, none of those put cards in your opponent's graveyard, especially if you have Force Negation. Force Negation, even in this deck, is kind of frustrating in that it exiles the card instead of countering it, so it doesn't help enable your Drowning Locks and your Into the Stories. So if your removal is like Path and Force Negation and all that stuff, you will actually just like, your opponent won't have cards to put in the graveyard.
Right. Yeah, I saw you also making considerations this round with Surgical Extraction, deciding whether or not to remove the cards from their graveyard or not.
Yeah, I was playing against Amulet, and normally against decks that don't have the ability to recur their cards that are in the graveyard, I would rather leave it there to add 1 to my Drown in the Lock and Into the Story count. But I had a Mystic Sanctuary in play and my opponent had Vesuva. So any fetch land would potentially let him pick up the Mystic Sanctuary, replay it, and get back one of the things. So I ended up needing to exile them.
Talk about some of the sideboard cards here. Oko, a card that's popping up in a lot of decks. You have 2 copies there. What's the purpose here?
I believe that there is a very high chance, like a over 50% chance, that Oko is the most powerful Planeswalker ever printed. And I think that it's just like generically good enough that it's a card that I decided that I want access to. Specifically, the primary places that it appeals to me are, I think that it's a very good way to pressure Blue-White's Planeswalkers, and I think that it's a very good card to close the game against burn. If you can stop them from killing you in the first 2 turns and play Oko, the life gain from the food just puts the game away. I think it also has utility in other spots, like against Jund and Tron, and like most mid-range decks, it's like, you know, it's common for control decks to have the ability to board into Planeswalkers. I didn't want to do this with this deck because I think that the End of the Story endgame is like good enough that you don't need that, but I think that like the fact that it only costs 3 and just the power level, it felt like it was something that I should have access to.
Plague Engineer, another card that can shut down a lot of decks, was very instrumental in helping you beat the hexproof deck in terms of finally clearing the board.
Yep.
Other cards, you got more removal here, you got more counter spells. Talk about Weather the Storm. I just assume burn.
Yeah. My deck is actually pretty bad against burn. I take a lot of damage from my lands, and it's like there are a lot of draws that are like slow enough that they can get under me if they resolve an Eidolon. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. So I like to have a lot of cards where it's just like, all right, well, if I draw this card, basically no matter what else happens, I'm going to win the game. And I feel like that's true with Pulse of Marasa and Weather the Storm, because they just gain so much life, and because of Fetch Lands and Mystic Sanctuary, I get to just do it over and over once I do it once. So it's kind of like, you gain the life once and it buys you another turn, but it's also just like a death sentence for them because they know that you're going to keep gaining more life in large increments.
You've played a couple events with this deck. You've been doing a lot of brewing, a lot of thinking. What's the next iteration? Are there cards, or maybe are there cards that you want in this deck that you haven't found a place yet?
Like, you can play around with what the finishers are. Like, instead of Torrential Gear, Hulk and Field of the Dead, You could certainly have like Tastiger, main deck Planeswalker of some sort. You can get weird with something like Pearl Lake Ancient or Haunting Echoes. I really like Astrolabe because basically the fact that you always want to fetch Mystic Sanctuary in the mid-game means that even if you fetch your black and green mana early, you end up choked on mana more as the game goes longer when you're trying to cast multiple spells in a turn and still only have one source of each of your off colors. And so it's really nice to have Astrolabes around just to fix your mana to allow you to cast multiple spells. And right now I only have one in, and so I wouldn't mind having more Astrolabes. But for the most part, this deck is in a place where I'm pretty happy with the list.
Yeah, this deck is the real deal. I think, you know, you've put a lot of work into it and get to seeing it on camera and do the full grindy game and then winning a game quickly once you kind of lock them out is really impressive. I have to say this is a work of art. Sam, thanks for joining me here on the sideboard. Stay tuned to Star City Games all weekend long for the action here in Indianapolis.